Some people didn't never seen a deaf person before. Am I your first deaf person? Here I am. Hello, hi. Obviously, there's an interpreter here with us. There's a little bit of a lag time between what I am communicating and when the interpreter is speaking, okay? This will be fun. It'll be a fun session. I would like to introduce Maria O'Neill Ruddock. Maria?
So we have our first communication glitch because we only have one microphone. Oh, we have another one. Awesome. 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 So we need two because Sandra's voice is Clayton. And so Clayton needs a microphone too. But we can pass back and forth if we need. But it kind of just talks about, right? We don't think of those kinds of things when we think, how do we accommodate deaf people? How do we accommodate people with hearing loss? And then what's the impact when we don't accommodate? What's the impact? I mean, today we're talking mental health, but just in terms of just general emotional well-being, right? So we want to be able to be thinking about that.
1, 2. Okay, I think that's coming through, right?
Okay. So Sandra and I work closely together. We work at the Community Center for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing in Cleveland at the at the Cleveland Hearing and Speech Center. And part of what we do is presentations. We're going to talk about that in just a second. Sandra is what we call a deaf advocate. So as an advocate, she is in many, many spaces, from courtrooms to hospitals, so advocating for individuals perhaps who are victims of violence, sexual assault, things like that, understanding the court process, and things of that nature. When we talk about advocacy, we also talk about advocating for equal access to communication and equal access to information. So we have two words of advocacy when we think of advocacy, and that is not only advocating for the rights of people who are deaf, but also being an advocate in the sense of in court and things like that. So today, what we want you to take away from this session is we want you to have an understanding of hearing loss and deafness. We want you to know about deaf culture. Again, we don't have a long time. We only have a little bit of time. So we're going to talk about just scratching the surface of deaf culture and what it's like to be deaf. We want you to understand American Sign Language, again, just a little bit. And then kind of communication accommodations and what works well, not only for college campuses, but just generally. And you were saying that you did have a deaf student and you had accommodations in the classroom. We're going to challenge you all to be thinking about outside of the classroom, because our life is not just in a classroom when we're deaf or hard of hearing. Our life exists more often outside of the classroom. So we're going to talk about that. And then we're also going to just give you an opportunity to ask questions. We don't mind if you ask questions throughout the session, but we will leave time at the end. Again, as we're talking about just communication, when you do want to ask a question, if you would be so kind as to make a visual signal that it's you that wants to speak. So then Sandra will be able to look at you and look at the interpreter at the same time. Similarly, we present a lot together and we do the same thing. We look at each other. If Sandra's saying something and I want to make a comment, I'll make sure that she can see me visually that I want to make a comment. And that's, again, kind of just keeping in mind that we always want to think visual, 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 because everything for a deaf person is here, not back here. So we're going to talk about just very quickly resources for you all. There are 8 community centers for the deaf around the state of Ohio in pretty much all the major cities: Youngstown, Toledo, Dayton, Cincinnati, Columbus, Cleveland, Canton, Youngstown. So they're very good resources because they are, we have staff such as ourselves. Most of the community centers, I have to say, I think all of the community centers are staffed by individuals who are deaf. So deaf individuals providing services to other deaf people. We do a lot of education and training because, you know, as we can see here today, most people have never met a deaf person. And deafness is invisible. You don't see it, so you don't know that a person is deaf. And so knowing kind of some of the things you're going to learn today will help you also to kind of not make mistakes when you are interacting with a deaf person. So I think that what's really, really important is that you have some ideas of strategies that you can use, because not everybody signs. And you're not going to be able to learn how to sign quickly, but you want to be able to be accommodating to a deaf person and know how to do that. So, Sandra's going to talk about just kind of generally some general information about deafness and hearing loss.
Okay. 1 in 10 individuals have hearing loss. That's a pretty high number. 90% of deaf children have hearing parents, which means there's no access to sign language there. I'm very fortunate. My parents are deaf. I am one of those 10%. I already had language from my home. I already had access to it. Obviously, you know, when a new person comes into being, you know, the medical group is where services are sought and found first. You know, we find out that this baby is deaf or something like that, and then we talk about fixing the ear and making them like hearing, and we don't learn about deafness or ASL until much later in life. You know, it's normal for parents. It's totally normal for parents to want to fix their children, but there is this beautiful culture and this beautiful language right here with us, with ASL. What's wrong with both of these worlds? Why can't they exist in harmony together, the hearing world and the deaf world? With that being said, many of the children at home, about 67% of them, don't know how to communicate with their parents, which leads to something we call LDS, which is language deprivation syndrome. Language deprivation syndrome is a mouthful to talk about. No access to language when you're growing up. And talking about, you know, less than 1% of these people are culturally deaf too. Think about that. I'm one of them. I'm one of those less than 1% of people who are culturally deaf, meaning all of the other people, they don't know about other things, which we'll talk about later in the presentation, like identity development. People who have language deprivation syndrome, or LDS, typically they'll graduate with around a 4th grade reading level. That's pretty low.
So, at least in terms of the college campus, you may not see those individuals who weren't introduced or didn't have language, what we're talking about, but you should be knowledgeable that if a child is not provided language, at the critical period of life, which is 0 to 5, they won't develop language in a typical fashion. And so many deaf children, because they aren't introduced to a visual language in their home, and it isn't until much later when there's intervention that their language then is delayed or becomes disfluent. And so consequently, you are continually behind. Likely on a college campus, you wouldn't see that because people have entrance exams they have to take. They have to, obviously, in order to be able to be a college student, they have to read above a fourth grade level to even be admitted to a college. So, but it's important for you all to be aware that this exists and it happens, and it's pretty significant. And we do a lot of talking on language deprivation. We also do a lot of training of mental health clinicians, because very often those individuals that have language deprivation have other issues that go along with it. Their ability to socialize, their ability to understand their emotions, their ability to manage their emotions is disrupted. And so therefore we see a lot more deaf individuals with LDS in the mental health system. So deaf people are 2 times more likely to have a mental health issue and need mental health care. Deaf children are 3 times more likely to suffer abuse, neglect, sexual assault, sexual abuse than hearing children. So think about all of those things as you think about, okay, now you have a deaf person on a college campus, and maybe they have language, but there might have been other issues that they have experienced, bullying and things of that nature.
I'd like to show you a picture. This is the ultimate irony. We just talked about when a baby is born, 90% of deaf children have hearing parents. The baby is born and you're at the doctor and the doctor's there to help you, right? Of course, that's natural. The doctor's going to talk about hearing aids, the doctor's going to talk about cochlear implants, the doctor's going to talk about all this, but not sign language. The fear is, well, if you let them learn sign language, then they'll always be behind in speech. That's a myth. That is false. That is false. You can develop these languages concurrently. Some people are able to learn speech, and if they want to learn speech, that's wonderful. If it's their choice, that's wonderful. But you have to provide both options. You've seen it on TikTok, on YouTube, on TV. Oh, look at this amazing video of this person signing. It's so beautiful. Let's teach your baby, your hearing baby, mind you. Let's teach your hearing baby how to sign more. Oh my gosh, look, they signed more. That's so adorable. But heaven forbid you have a deaf child. You shall not teach them sign language. Teach them lip reading. Teach them how to speak. Why is it different? If they're born deaf, that means they're born deaf into a wonderful culture and a world with their own language. You have to consider the different philosophies, like Alexander Graham Bell. Alexander Graham Bell, he was a staunch supporter of what's known as the oralist method, and to not support sign language, and that's completely false. I mean, I grew up in speech class myself. I can use English. I can hear a little bit. But I also use sign language, and I'm fine. Look at me. I'm normal. I'm just like all of you. If I use sign language, does that mean I'm delayed or I'm behind or less than all of you? No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. It is so important to provide access to both of these languages, which are both equally beautiful in their own right. A cochlear implant or a hearing aid is a device. Imagine you are working with somebody in dorm life, okay, and they're asleep in the dorm, and there's an emergency. I don't sleep with my hearing aid in. People don't sleep with their devices on. I don't know if you knew that or not. So you're awoken abruptly in the middle of the night, and for an emergency, you're not going to have time to stop and find their device. And how do you communicate with a deaf person? How do you communicate with the deaf student? Or, okay, suppose you're out of the dorm now and you're in a safe area, and you've got to communicate with them, but they don't have their device with them. They're still deaf, and it's going to be a challenge. So this picture might seem ironic, and it is ironic, but it still happens, still to this day.
So as Sandra was mentioning, most of the time when a child is born, there's medical people involved, and the focus is on fixing. As you see, Sandra doesn't ever feel like she needed to be fixed. She was fine the way she was born. She happens to use amplification. Most children are fitted with amplification. That, again, to remember the fact that whether it's a cochlear implant, which is a surgery that's conducted early, usually before the baby is 1, and sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. When it's effective, the person actually can hear mechanical speech and language. When it doesn't work, we find out years later when things are not working, and now we're 3 years into a child's development and the cochlear implant didn't work. They're not picking up speech sounds with their cochlear. They're not able to pick up speech sounds with a hearing aid. So now we haven't introduced anything except for maybe some gestures and some individual words, maybe a couple of things on the mouth. We're going to talk about lip reading in a minute, but it's not effective. So then what happens? And as Sandra was mentioning, you take your cochlear off, you take your hearing aid off, you're deaf. So it fixes it for when you're wearing it, but when you're swimming, it can't be working. When, it's in the charger at night, your cochlear doesn't, you're not hearing, and so on and so forth. So it's just important to kind of keep that in mind, that it's not a fix. It's a kind of temporary solution, but again, doesn't work for everyone. And there are a lot of students that you might encounter that have had some pretty negative experiences, either with trying to get the cochlear to work, or, years of speech therapy of, use your voice is beautiful, use your voice. And then when they're adults and they're in the community, nobody understands their voice. And they're like, but my speech teacher told me I had a beautiful voice and nobody understands my voice. And so those kinds of things are traumatic experiences for a deaf person.
Can I actually add a comment about that, talking about cochlear implants? Many recipients who receive a cochlear implant when they're young, for medical reasons or for reasons of it not fulfilling its purpose, they don't use the cochlear implant anymore. They've grown up and existed in a world for the first 18 years of their life where everything's focused on, speech and hearing and being like the hearing people. And then once they become 18, they find their people, they find their community, and they don't wear their cochlear implant anymore. Everybody's different here. There's a wide range. Now, talking about deaf culture and deaf identity. Capital D, big D deaf, like me. I identify as a deaf person. I'm involved with deaf culture. I'm involved with the deaf community. We have bowling tournaments. We have, obviously I work for this community center for the deaf. And, we have all the features of a community. People with, a small d deaf would be, someone who has hearing loss. They don't prescribe to the cultural identity, but they just can't hear as well. Many, many, many people with cochlear implants, especially people with cochlear implants, they've discovered their identity really late in life because as they go through their, formative years, dealing with their parents and the hearing school and the speech and everything like that, and then finally they're 18 or 19 and they're ready to go to college and they want to go to Gallaudet. Gallaudet is a deaf university in Washington, D.C., and they want to go there. And they realize that hey, these other deaf people, they're like me. I have identity just like them. Some people will identify as hard of hearing. Sometimes I will, depending on the group I'm with, identify as hard of hearing. For audiologists, obviously I tell them I'm hard of hearing because, I can hear a little bit and I can speak. But when I'm with the deaf community, I tell them I'm deaf because, I identify with them culturally. And deaf blind, deaf people have obviously a range of vision, just like other people. Then you'll also see deaf plus. Have you heard this or seen this before? Deaf plus. It's it's a little bit more of a progressive term to talk about deaf with additional disability. Could be a deaf person who has cerebral palsy, or a deaf person who uses a wheelchair, or somebody with autism or Down syndrome or something like that. It's a little bit more of a, disability. That word, disability, we don't like that word. So we have our own culture. We're not disabled. We don't identify as disabled. So, we've decided that, we can use our words however we want them. So we decided for deaf plus. And I also do want to emphasize hearing impaired. You will hear hearing impaired. I hate that word. I cannot. I have no impairment. I am not impaired. I have no issues in that area. I really do encourage all of you to avoid using the word hearing impaired. I know people with hearing loss, I know senior citizens have, difficulties with hearing, but, I would prefer to identify them as people with hearing loss rather than, oh, they are hearing impaired. It's just, sometimes people come to me and say, hey, you're hearing impaired. And I'm like, no, I'm deaf. I'm not hearing impaired. Hearing impaired can be very insulting to someone, but I'm used to it. I'm accustomed to it. I live in a hearing world. I do. And, I try my best to police my facial expressions, but other people will gladly tell you how they feel with that term via their facial expressions. I will tell you a story one time. Today, when I came in here, this woman came up to me and started talking away like a mile a minute and was speaking to me. And I'm like, hey, I tried to gesture, said, hey, I'm deaf. Hey, I can't hear you. And I realized that she wasn't understanding what I was trying to communicate with her. And I was like, hey, I was like, hey, can you, whoa, can we like slow down here? And I'm like tapping my ear and I'm like, hey, can you look at me? Like, I'm deaf. Hello. Okay, here's your lesson. If people gesture like this, we're not going to bite. I promise. We're not going to bite. We're humans, just like all of you. We're not going to throw things. We're not going to fight. I promise. We have our own language. That's all.
I just wanted to add to what Sandra was saying about individuals with hearing loss or people that are hard of hearing also need accommodations. So sometimes it's easy. You kind of think, oh, okay, a person's deaf. They're going to use sign language. Not every deaf person uses sign language. And not all people with hearing loss or people that are hard of hearing need accommodations, but you want to be able to ask them. But most often you want to keep in mind that it is like Sandra was mentioning when she came in today, how would a person know that she was deaf, right? You don't know a person is deaf. But the issue might be don't assume, right? So you could be behind someone, let's say at Starbucks getting a coffee, and maybe you're talking to the person in front of you and that person doesn't respond. What's the first thing you're going to think about is like, oh, that person's such a snob, doesn't want to talk to me, or they're trying to ignore me. It could be that the person's deaf. It could be that the person has hearing loss. So just kind of keep that in mind. And we don't think about that because the percentage of individuals that are deaf or hard of hearing is small relative to other groups. And so we don't think about it. So after today, we want you to think about it, that if somebody doesn't respond in a typical fashion, it could be because they're deaf or they have hearing loss. So as Sandra was saying, this is kind of a good picture, kind of recognizing that people who are hard of hearing or of hearing loss usually do not identify as culturally deaf people, and they usually don't use American Sign Language. That's not everybody. When you've met one person with hearing loss or a person who's deaf, you've met one. But most often they kind of affiliate themselves with people that are hard of hearing, affiliate with the hearing culture, so to speak. And yet there are challenges to that because there's a lot of information that's missing when you are a person that is hard of hearing. You miss a lot. And so even though all your friends might be hearing, you may not be fully included or feel fully included because maybe you need information repeated. Maybe you've missed the conversation because you're in the front of the room and somebody says something in the back of the room and you didn't pick it up, and then you have to ask for repetition or ask for somebody to tell you what was said. So.
And now let's talk about cultural norms. How to get someone's attention. You could stomp on the floor, you could flash the lights, you could, bang on the table. They can't hear you. Pointing. We use pointing. I know in hearing culture it's not appropriate to point at people or point at things, but we index people all the time. Body language. We're very expressive. We're very emotive. We need to use our space. Restaurants, it's my biggest pet peeve. They put that beautiful vase in the table or all the cups. We're constantly spilling them. I prefer a nice, clean table with so much space for all of our loud conversations. Eye contact. Eye contact is so important. We can't hear you, but we can see if you're smiling. We can see if you're laughing. We can see if you're mad. You can hear tone, right? I can't hear tone, but I can read your face. Personal space, like I just said, we employ the use of our personal space like this projector screen over here. I've almost punched it a few times already today. We're very blunt. We are very direct. I will say, hey, do you see that woman over there with, large hips and she's got some big breasts? You see her? With very facial expressions, look at this way, and specifics that way. We're very, very, very descriptive with our use of language. Sometimes we'll come in, you'll see someone say, hey, what happened? You gained so much weight. We say that to each other. That's normal for us. And I know in hearing culture, people will be like, oh, that's so offensive. But not for us. We're very affectionate. We'll use the I love you hand sign. It's, like a representation of our deaf values. It doesn't mean like, oh, I'm really in love with you. No, it doesn't. It's just like, hey, I care about you. I respect you. We cherish each other. We are the same community. We'll meet each other for the first time. It doesn't matter. It's fine. We'll hug. We'll give each other a hug. That's very normal. We're very huggy people. Applause. We can't hear you clapping your hands, so we do visual applause where we shake our hands. We like to collect information. I can't tell you how many times it happens. I'll be talking to someone, they'll say, hey, where are you from? Hey, where are you from? Well, I went to Gallaudet. Well, I know this person. Well, I know them too. Hey, we know each other. I can connect with anybody all over the United States here. I could find somebody that knows somebody who knows me. Weddings, oh my gosh, weddings. It's very typical for weddings. There will be a deaf group and the hearing group, and we're not dancing. We're going to be telling stories with each other. We'll be lined up in a big circle, and like a setup here in this classroom is not deaf friendly. If we were in Gallaudet University, the tables and chairs would be set up in a U so we can see each other. Think about that on your college campuses. How would that look like in your classrooms? How would they see each other's facial expressions? I went to college, of course, and I would meet with professors, the hearing professors, and I would meet with them. And I said, hey, if we're in a small classroom, would you mind can we set the desk up in a U shape? Or if we're doing some sort of like, like presentation or like some sort of, performance or something like that, or a little skit, or if it's a debate, if we're having a hearty debate in class, it's really wonderful to be able to see who's speaking. Or if in an auditorium, it's great to sit near the front so we can see the interpreter. But I have so much more to talk about, but we'll get into more later as the presentation goes. I don't want to spill all the beans now. We are normal. We are just like other people. And yes, I can drive. I drive with my feet. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I get that question all the time. People ask me, can you drive? Actually, believe it or not, the insurance company said deaf people are better drivers than hearing people because our eyes are very, 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 very keen. I mean, we're more visually attuned to our world than deaf people are because that's how we perceive this world. Yes, we can work. Yes, we can have a family. I have 3 children myself. We can make our own decisions, and we know how. Sometimes we will face barriers such as restaurants or experiencing that awkward moment when the server is like, oh, this person's deaf. Oh my gosh, what do I do? I'm like, I'm not going to bite you. I promise. I won't bite you. Sometimes I'm able to, have a good interaction with them. Sometimes I'm not. Movie theaters, I really prefer streaming. I prefer to stay at home because there's captions. They're ready. They're on the media. I mean, if I want to go to the theater, first thing I have to do is I have to get there early, and then I have to wait in line, and then I have to ask for the caption device. So imagine people with glasses. So I'd have to put the captive view on top of my glasses, and then so imagine, and it's just, and I wear a hearing aid as well, and then I've got to wear this device, and it's heavy, and sometimes it stops working, which means I've got to get up in the middle of the movie and go ask for a new one, and of course I've missed all this. It's not a good experience. So I don't go to the theater. Doctors' experiences are, I think we actually talk about this on the next slide. I have my appointment, I arrive, I get there, I'm sitting, I'm waiting, you get called, you go in, it's great, it's wonderful, right? What about you? Or what about my experience? I've got to arrive early, I've got to be paranoid. Is the interpreter going to show up? Am I going to know the interpreter? Are they going to understand me? Will they work? I don't know. So I'm asking the receptionist, I'm freaking out, the receptionist doesn't know, they're like, go sit down. And I'm already on edge. I'm already freaking out. And then, my appointment time has passed, and I go up to the front counter, and I'm like, hey, what's going on? And they're like, oh, I'm sorry, we forgot to schedule you an interpreter. Let's reschedule it. I'm like, reschedule? But you've never experienced that before. I mean, that never happens to any of you. That happens to us all the time, and it's very, very, very frustrating. Think about, I have a job. I had to request time off. I had to use my PTO to get this appointment, and now I've got to reschedule it, and they're so full that the next available appointment is 6 months from now, and that's not fair. The doctor's office is not fun. It is not fun. I hate going to the doctor's office because I know problems will exist. VRI, or video remote interpreting, is like having an interpreter on a device. It's not like having the interpreter here in person. It's different. It's on the device. So, I'm pregnant, okay? I am going to get an ultrasound to make sure everything's okay and everybody's developing appropriately. I'm laying down on the table and I'm getting the ultrasound. I'm laying down on the table and they're trying to get this electronic screen on a little tripod on wheels, and it's in an ultrasound room, so it's dark, and I'm laying on my back, and needless to say, it was not successful. We'll actually talk about VRI on the next slide, I think. Maria?
I just want to add to what Sandra's saying, just in thinking about the day-to-day kinds of barriers that are thrown in front of deaf people that we don't experience. We don't go into our doctor's appointment. Well, sometimes we do because we're nervous about being sick, perhaps, but that's what we're nervous about. We don't have the added burden of wondering if our communication access is going to be either denied, right? Or the interpreter isn't qualified interpreter, or even simple things like being called. You'll say to the nurse, remember, I'm deaf, so come and get me when it's my turn. And they always forget. So they call out, Sandra, Sandra Hadabovic, Sandra Hadabovic. Sandra's not watching, or she might be so nervous that she's like trying to watch and trying to see the nurse's, mouth, and we don't have to experience that. So, yes, please.
This made me think about, I used to work in an outpatient clinic, and it happened probably more than twice, but it was a deaf individual, again, right, interpreter was not scheduled, and then I believe it was a Spanish-speaking person, the same thing happened. So in regards to like policy change, it became responsibility of like this one department. I think it was like one person, but if she was off, someone else, and then the request would always like automatically be flagged and go to her. So then they would like definitely be scheduled. But I hated that for one. As Sandra said, like someone took the time, maybe they come to classes, daycare, all the things for that to happen. But it also shows, it was mentioned earlier, like it's just not about being nice. Like that had to be a policy change. You know what I mean? So when we're talking like impacting change, that's something that had to like move upstream so that we could stop it.
Not only that, that applies everywhere, not just people here, but everywhere, all over the place. Yes. It would be nice. I wish we could have you everywhere, all over the place.
No, it's very true that we want policies to change so that it's an automatic when a person requests interpretation that it's then in their file. But there's so many missed opportunities. Most critical are things like victims of crime and victims of sexual assault, of domestic violence, because when you are going in, for example, for a protection order, you go to court to get a protection order, there has to be an interpreter before you can, see the judge. What if there isn't an interpreter available? Then what happens? We've had situations where we've had clients wait days. Now they're in harm's way. They're in danger and they can't get a protection order. We had one woman that we worked with who was trying to file a sexual assault report, and the police department argued for 3 days about who should be providing the interpreter to take the report. 3 days the woman had to stay waiting to file a report of sexual assault. So these are things that deaf people experience. So again, when we talk about mental health issues and that kind of thing, you can see why there would be additional kind of layers on top because of really communication access.
Let's talk about ASL. How are we doing with time, Maria? Are we good? I think we're doing perfect. ASL is visual. ASL is very visual, and it is a beautiful language. It's actually the third most popular language here in the USA, believe it or not. Signed English and signing English is different. So in English, in writing, it would say, I am going to the store, right? In sign language, you would simply sign store, point to yourself, say, me, go. So imagine if you're asking a deaf individual, can you write this down? Or if you're asking them to write, what they write in English is not reflective of their intelligence level. Some people just prefer or are more proficient at American Sign Language. Our body language and our facial expressions are paramount. We are, in every meaning of the word, very loud. But we can't hear, so we're loud with our signs. Talking about lip reading, some people can lip read. The video, I think we have a video on the next slide. Lip reading, will it give you 100% understanding? Can you 100% lip read people? No, no. It's only about 25 to 30%. And that's considering people who, are the experts or the professionals at lip reading. Think about the other 70% of the information that you're missing. Is lip reading worth it? Is lip reading a worthy method to deliver information? No. ASL is. ASL is a wonderful modality for delivering information. And some people do like to lip read, but it is a challenge during COVID. During COVID, it was tough. Think about the masks. You're going through the deli. You want to order some sliced meat. I want 1 pound. They'll ask, do you want it shaved or do you want it sliced? Do you want it thick? And I'm like, I'm sorry, can you pull your mask down, please? And they wouldn't, and they would just repeat. And I couldn't understand what they were saying. I understand they were doing it to protect themselves and protect all of us. And they were really adamant, for safety reasons, they wouldn't. They were really strict with their masks. It was a really tough time for deaf people, especially reading facial expressions when people you're interacting with. Also, when looking at an interpreter and working with an interpreter, they have a mask on, so you're still missing some of the information. But of course, it was beneficial. I think we have an activity that we're gonna do. Maria's going to give us 3 words without her voice, and I want you to guess what she's saying. Did they all look? Were they all the same?
Maybe.
Maybe.
Baby.
Maybe and baby. But there were 3 words. They all looked the same. All 3 words looked the same, but they were different. The first one was maybe. The second one was baby. And the third one was pay me. They all looked identical. And when I'm lip reading somebody, I'll ask somebody to repeat them. I am hard of hearing. When there's no interpreter, I do my best to get by. And I will squint and I will scour. And I'm like, are you calling me a baby? Or did you say maybe? Am I supposed to pay you? What do you mean? But I just don't consider lip reading effective. But again, it depends on the individual. Some people, sometimes, they are successful lip reading. But think about it. If you're chewing gum or if you have, lettuce in your teeth or a beard, it's not good. It's very distracting, especially with food in your teeth.
I was thinking that we could hold the video. We'll go on and at the end.
Okay, sure.
So I want to get to some accommodation before we get to the end. And if we have time at the end, we're just going to show you a little example of lip reading. It's a really great link, and we'll show it to you. But just kind of things for you all to kind of keep in mind as we talk about communication strategies and accommodations, particularly for college students. And one of the things that we say that we really believe very strongly is that there are 2 issues for deaf and hard of hearing individuals that help them feel safe on college campuses: communication access and information. Those 2. Equal access to information and equal access to communication. So how do we do that? Obviously, we do that in the classroom with ASL interpreters, with note takers, with speech-to-text services like CART captioning. C-print is another thing that we used. There's another technology called TypeWell. So again, there's many deaf people will actually sometimes ask for 2 accommodations, and sometimes those accommodations are for classes that have highly specialized vocabulary: psychology, social work, law, the sciences, foreign languages, where you really need to have that specific vocabulary in order to succeed in the class. And so that it may be that the student requests dual accommodations. And then also the other thing is special seating. Very often a deaf person will ask to be in the front, particularly if it's like a situation where there's an auditorium. They'll ask to sit in the front and have the interpreter they can see the interpreter clearly. But also remember in the classroom, when there's someone who's raising their hand behind the person, right, and the professor is calling on a person behind that deaf person's watching the interpreter, but they may want to be able to look back as to see who is speaking. So they know, okay, oh, yeah, that's John asking that question, because the interpreter isn't going to know all the names of everybody in the classroom. So in any event, so those are things that you all know. Those are typical accommodations that are requested. So do you mind?
And also, deaf people have perfect attendance. Because, if we miss class, the interpreter's not going to be there. So we skip class few and far between. We really do, I swear.
So what do you have to know about the interpreter? And most colleges today do a very good job of this, but not all interpreters are created equal. And most interpreters have an area of specialization. So you would have perhaps a legal interpreter that would go to court, but that person may not be an interpreter that goes and interprets on a college campus. They're not interpreting for French class. Because think about the skills needed for French versus the skills needed for math. Right? So you want the interpreter to be very highly qualified. Very often, some of our social service agencies just kind of pick anybody, and they're not always qualified interpreters. And as a provider of a service, you have the right, as a hearing person requesting the interpreter, to find out, like ask the agency, particularly for mental health, does this person have experience in mental health settings? Because again, that's a whole different level of interpreting. We don't have time to talk about that today, but it's very highly specialized, and there's a particular protocol that therapists should be keeping in mind when we're talking about interpreting in mental health. So, but what else? So with these, we're just talking about areas of expertise. So what other things on a campus would you want to be thinking about for a person who is deaf or hard of hearing, so that they feel included in all aspects of college life? So think about things like group projects, field trips, advisory meetings. You might think, oh, of course you provide for an advisor, but you don't necessarily think about a group project. What is that deaf individual going to do if the assignment requires to be in a group and the person uses an interpreter, right? So you want to make sure that you are accommodating for that. Beyond the classroom, even more important in terms of feelings of inclusivity on a campus. So one of the things that is most important, and it's pretty easy today on college campuses because people have cell phones, that they get text alerts, very important, but other kinds of announcements that are particularly for emergencies, you want to make sure that the campus is prepared to have visual alerts for people that have hearing loss or people who are deaf, that all televisions on campuses have the capacity to have closed caption. Turn it on, right? Think about, that's just a small little thing you can do on a campus to make a person feel like, oh, wow, they're paying attention to me, right? They're actually, I know what's going on in that television because the captioning's on. Things like sporting events. So we have recently been working with the Cleveland Cavaliers on how can they become more accessible. So when deaf people go to watch a Cavs game, that the Jumbotron has captioning. It's not a big deal. It's not, could they afford it? Of course they can afford it, right? So those are, again, small accommodations that allow a person with hearing loss to be able to fully participate in the same things that we get to participate in. The other thing that we urge people to keep in mind is, how about food? How about the cafeteria? How great would it be if we didn't have to speak what we want, if we would be able to point to a menu, to have an online ordering? It's so easy, right? I mean, we have phones, we have kiosks that we don't have to be able to speak it. Similarly, just think about if Sandra or another deaf person wants to order something from McDonald's. I know this isn't in campus it might be going through a drive-through. What happens to a deaf person at a drive-through? They have to speak into a box. Well, they don't use their voice. So what do? They type it in their phone. They get up to the window and they show the person what they want. And usually the reaction is not good. It's like, oh, but you're supposed to order from the box. Well, you can't order from a box if your voice isn't clear. So, again, just things like that to kind of keep in mind. And that makes a deaf person, helps that person feel like they are included in the campus life. Do you want to add?
Also with signage. You had a wonderful job with signage. Maria had no idea where she was going for this conference today, but as soon as I came in, I spotted the sign. I said, we're going to the 4th floor. I went up to the 4th floor. It's so important to have signage too. Deaf people are so visual. Just using simple signs makes a huge change for us. It's just important to interact with deaf people. We just can't hear. And today with technology is so fascinating. You can have speech to text on your phone, and I can type on my phone. You can gesture, especially, making sure customers are happy, Think about their facial expressions, When you come in, you meet a deaf person, hey, oh, come on this way. You guys know gestures. You all can gesture. I know you can. You can communicate with them. You can say, come with me one way, this way, or one moment, or, just wait, just gesture with them. A deaf person will feel like, hey, you actually want to help me. You care. That's going to make me feel so much better than if I come in and I tell you you're deaf and you're like just talking to me, well, go over there and just go over there. You need to go over there. And I'm like, whoa, chill. Why are you mad at me? Why I'm not mad at you? Why are you mad at me? That's a huge turnoff. It's not friendly. Think about college campus and college life. Just make them feel welcome. What's most important is asking them, how can we improve to make sure you feel welcome? How are your classrooms? Do you need to make sure you get the PowerPoints before class? Typically, PowerPoints are used in class, and they're given to the interpreter, and they're also given to the deaf student before class because we don't have the capacity to look at the PowerPoint, look at the professor, look at the interpreter, look at our notes all at the same time. Imagine if we're doing math. Math is so difficult. It's one of the main reasons why I employ the use of a note taker. Algebra, when you've got the x, q, y equals this, that with the bar and all this. And, I'm looking at the interpreter, or I'm looking at the screen, like Maria mentioned, dual accommodations. It would be impossible for me to watch the whiteboard and a professor and my notes and the interpreter all at once.
I had a thought. I just lost it, but go on.
Okay. How would you work with me, Obviously, you know, being face to face. When communicating with each other, you know, we would look at each other. You know, of course, these are under the assumptions that if an interpreter is not there. You know, if we have access to an interpreter, you know, we'll look back and forth, but sometimes it's awkward. I mean, I've bumped into an interpreter before. Sometimes the interpreter has bumped into, you know, one of the presenters before, and it's really important for things like that to be communicated. Hey, are you going to move? Are you going to walk around? It's also important to assess the needs of the deaf individual, because the needs of the deaf individual do come first. You know, where would you like to sit? Would you like to be here the whole time? Where would you like the interpreter to stand? So on and so forth. Cochlear implants and hearing aids are wonderful devices for amplification, but it's not a replacement for speech. It won't make them like a hearing person. It might make you, you know, inclined to shout at a deaf person. I mean, you may want to speak a tiny bit louder, but please say it. Don't spray it. I don't need to know the contents of your mouth. Be friendly. Be welcoming. Yeah, go ahead.
I do just want to give you a 2-minute warning.
Okay, thank you. Perfect. This is our last slide right here. How about you guys? Do you have any questions?
Also, just recognize your own biases, because we all have them. And as hearing people that have never met a deaf person, it's natural to feel uncomfortable and awkward because we're compassionate, caring people. We want to be able to communicate. So what we want to do is be able to say, you know, I was recently at a meeting, and we were all at the table signing, and the person that was kind of saying hello to everybody in the restaurant just avoided coming over to the table. It would have been just easy to be able to say, hey, how are you guys? Just that would have made the team feel like, oh, but she was feeling so nervous and awkward. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know sign. And so she thought, well, I just won't do anything. I'll just bypass this group. So we don't want to do that. Last minute questions.
Yeah.
Are there accents or dialects?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Yes, definitely there are. In the South, they're very laid back. They sign very differently. In the North, they sign so fast in the North. In Europe, I'm from Europe, and I catch myself signing different languages sometimes, like, that's the wrong language. There's also, you know, like international sign or gesture. But yes, there are different accents in sign language. Some people sign very fast, and some people sign very slow. And I'm a mix. I can be casual. I can be chill. It depends on the presentation. It depends on the interpreter. Are the interpreter and I, are we vibing? Are we working well together? Are we ready to go full speed ahead, or are we not? Are we choppy? It depends.
Good question. Other questions? Just know that on the